I'm going to really try to put theory to work, so I don't have a written paper, but I'm going to take you through what is actually my work in progress at the moment. And it revolves around three female philosophers that are listed here in the first sentence: Suzanne Langer, Helene Metzger, and Eva Louise Young. And I'm going to take you through how I'm actually trying to work with their works and also reflect upon what it actually means to be a scholar today. And in that sense, the theoretical realm in which I'm working at the moment, I think you should say, is composed of moving away from or working with what used to be called archival positivism, the idea that when you go into the archive you can get it right. Then later on we started to, as critical scholars, we moved to social constructivism and started to critique archives and to say, like, archives are actually devices or apparatuses, they're environments that are not neutral, they're completely, power-laden. Then we moved to an effective turn of archival practices and processes, working with, for example, identity politics in order to set up archives. We decided to work with, instead of their knowledge and truth value, we started to work with having a feeling for the artifact. And we also started to work very much on archiving as artists, or with artists when you're not an artist like me. And I think what I'm trying to do, so the where in terms of the theory that I'm trying to put to work, is more like a speculative turn in engaging with archives. And why do I do that? Well, I'm working with three forgotten, found, and active female philosophers that have wildly differing takes on citation and on citation politics. And why is citation politics so important? Well, and this is a quote that I encountered at the GIA conference at Middlesex University, and it was actually read by the Feminist Educators Against Sexism and their site club. So, of course, I'm putting that, on top of my PowerPoint slide. And they actually told us about a recently published article, Citation Matters, Mobilizing the Politics of Citation toward a Practice of Conscientious Engagement, in which two authors, Mott and Cockayne, said, we argue for a conscientious engagement with the politics of citation that is mindful of how citational practices can be tools for either the reification of or resistance to unethical hierarchies of knowledge. Our approach is qualitative and conceptual and offers a productive way to understand how citation can be rethought as a feminist and anti-racist technology. To ignore the politics of citation risks the continued hegemony of white heteromasculine knowledge production, incongruous with the nuance and richness of other understandings and perspectives. And then they continue saying something about geography, but that is not relevant, because I'm working with the politics of citation and trying to figure out what then what the scholar is today, who's working, who's constantly, of course, citing and who's also being cited, to refer back again to Jerry. And I've always been interested in this. I think the politics of citation as a feminist academic is a really important matter. It has a lot to do with archives and with archiving knowledge, but with working in the digital age, there are some important issues to be unpacked, and I'm going to try to do that. And I'm going to do that, of course, from a particular perspective, and that is the perspective of, let's say, generational feminism, and then, of course, in a generative key, so in a new materialist key that I've been working with or on for a couple of years now. And I will just read you a little bit about what that practice of generative generational feminism looks like. So I always say that. So let me just read it. So Henri Bergson, who's a French philosopher, as you all know, Henri Bergson's argument around the issue of generationality, and the argument is both subject to sexual difference and it is also sexually differing simultaneously. So his argument reads as follows. The truth is that if language here were molded on reality, we should not say the child becomes the man, but there is becoming from the child to the man. In the second proposition, becoming is a subject. It comes to the front. It is the reality itself. Childhood and manhood are then only possible stops, mere views of the mind. We now have to do with the objective movement itself. So, and I find these ways of thinking about generation, but also about, as you can see here on the slide, sexual difference and sexual differing, very important because they do justice to both process, they do justice to both objective movement, but also these stops and these hierarchies that are actually created in that objective movement, in that flow, in that process, in that flux, whatever word we're using for. So I'm always working on a multiple leveled, with a multiple leveled, kind of toolbox, theoretical toolbox. And this has been unpacked by many scholars who've worked on generationality. And generationality here is just my example. Because when you go back to the etymology of the word generation, you see that it includes both to generate, this objective movement of Bergson, but also generations as stops, as classes, as this classificatory schema that we always think about when we think about generationality. So you can say that this objective movement then is ontology, and these stops is epistemology. So we should never move from epistemology, project something back to this objective movement. We should always start with the objective movement and try to find out how these stops are being produced in this flow. So that is my new materialist perspective that we can talk about more. And these are just preliminary remarks in order to kind of talk a little bit about how I do my research and what are the theories and the perspectives that I'm trying to put to work today in this project around these three forgotten female philosophers. And in fact, when I talk about these three women, so Langer, Metzger, and Young, and I don't even know if Young was a doctor, so there's many things unknown about her. She actually published a book with the University of Manchester Press. One book, but I'll get back to that. I always research them by looking very closely at the current textual production of Maria Popova. So she is Bulgarian, born in '84, and she has this website that many of you may know called Brain Pickings. And if you don't know it, brainpickings.org, look it up and become a member of the mailing list because it's really cool. And I think Popova provides us with a model through which or by which we can actually study the work of Langer, Metzger, and Young, about whom a lot is unknown, and it is, and the way in which they actually talk about their work, especially Langer, comes very close to this feeling of I'm being written. I'm not writing. I'm not driving. I'm actually, I'm being written. So how does this all work? Yes. So this is Maria Popova in her office, I guess, at home in the United States, in Brooklyn. This is and I'm going to give, of all of my 4 examples, I'm going to give quotes, and I'm going to talk about the method that I'm using in order to come closer to how they do their work what their citations do, how their citational practice works, and how I'm trying to actually reach their archive. One archive is excessive, it includes everything, and the other archive is non-existent, but potentially also speculatively also is as wide as Langer envisioned her archive, but I'll get back to that. So first I want to read an article with you, one of the articles of brain picking. So what Maria Popova does is she writes articles on brainpickings.org, and she does that every day. The topic she's writing about, they differ. Sometimes she writes about medieval sources. She can also write about something that was published yesterday, and most importantly, she connects all of these sources to one another in very interesting ways. So you can just read with me, I think. So this one is called The Difficult Art of Counter-Criticism, Rebecca Solnit on Celebrating Complexity, Savoring the Unquantifiable, and Defying the Urge to Simplify and Contain. So first I'll read it with you, and then I will highlight why I've chosen it and what I find so interesting and instrumental about it. So there is a kind of counter-criticism that can liberate a work of art to be seen fully, to remain alive, to engage in a conversation that will not ever end, but will instead keep feeding the imagination. Behind the cotton wool is a hidden pattern. The whole world is a work of art, Virginia Woolf wrote in her sublime meditation on the recognition of subtleties and interconnections at the heart of creative work. There is no Shakespeare, there is no Beethoven, certainly and empathetically, there is no God. We are the words, we are the music, we are the thing itself. And yet, in the lapse between Woolf's time and ours, we have lost sight of our thingness and ceased seeing the pattern behind the cotton wool. Ours is an age bedeviled by the urge, an urge bearing the ominous compulsiveness of addiction, to reduce, flatten, and simplify what is more expansive, dimensional, and complex than can be easily understood. Too often, we chose this ease, the ease of reflexive reactions and instant opinions over the difficult but nourishing work of consideration. As if the sensationalist headlines of the news media weren't corrosive enough to the contemplative necessities of the human spirit, even our cultural commentary on such supreme temples of contemplation as literature and art has taken on the same predatory tendency to traffic in simplistic, often sadistic criticism that impoverishes the conversation in our collective conscience of nuance. I keep seeing more and more connections to the first talk, but anyway. But there is another way, an antidote that, by countering these poisonous narratives, enriches and perhaps even saves our interior lives. That antidote is what Rebecca Solnit, unparalleled high priestess of nuance and intelligent contemplation, explores in a piece titled Wolf's Darkness, embracing the inexplicable found in her subversive and sanctifying essay collection, Man Explain Things to Me. Solnit notes that much of our commentary on art and culture embodies a kind of aggression against the slipperiness of the work and the ambiguities of the artist's intent, and a desire to make certain what is uncertain, to know what is unknowable, to turn the flight across the sky into the roast upon the plate to classify and contain. She points to the alternative, an alternative we frequently forget exists at all. There is a kind of counter-criticism that seeks to expand the work of art by connecting it, opening up its meanings, inviting the possibilities. A great work of criticism can liberate a work of art to be seen fully, to remain alive, to engage in a conversation that will not ever end, but will instead keep feeding the imagination. Not against interpretation, but against confinement, against the killing of the spirit. Such criticism is itself great art. This is a kind of criticism that does not pit the critic against the text, does not seek authority. It seeks instead to travel with the work and its ideas, to invite it to blossom and invite others into a conversation that might have previously seemed impenetrable, to draw out relationships that might have been unseen and open doors that might have been locked. This is a kind of criticism that respects the essential mystery of a work of art, which is in part its beauty and its pleasure, both of which are irreducible and subjective. The worst criticism seeks to have the last word and leave the rest of us in silence. The best opens up an exchange that need never end. Solnit borrows, writes Popova, borrows her friend Chip Ward's term, the tyranny of the quantifiable, and considers how we impoverish our imagination whenever we relinquish the unquantifiable for systems of accounting that can't count what matters. Another quote from Solnit, and then we're almost done with this. What can be measured almost always takes precedence over what cannot. Private profit over public good, speed and efficiency over enjoyment and quality, the utilitarian over the mysteries and meanings that are of greater use to our survival and to more than our survival, to lives that have some purpose and value, that survive beyond us, to make a civilization worth having. The tyranny of the quantifiable is partly a failure of language and discourse to describe more complex, subtle and fluid phenomena, as well as the failure of those who shape opinions and make decisions to understand and value these slipperier things. So Popova continues, in a sentiment that calls to mind bryologist and Native American storyteller Robin Wall Kimmerer's beautiful case for how the naming of things confers dignity upon their existence, Solnit adds, "It is difficult, sometimes even impossible, to value what cannot be named or described, and so the task of naming and describing is an essential one in any revolt against the status quo of capitalism and consumerism." Popova, with an eye to Virginia Woolf as a writer who consistently defied this tendency to reduce and contain by modeling its opposite for generations, Solnit, a wolf, perhaps the wolf of our time in myriad ways, reflects, "My own task, these past 20 years or so, of living by words, has been to try to find or make a language to describe the subtleties, the incalculables, the pleasures and meanings impossible to categorize at the heart of things. This delicate mesh of meaning and subtleties is what Woolf meant by the pattern behind the cotton wool. This too, what was Albert Einstein had in mind when he marveled that there lies something deeply hidden behind the nature of things." Solnit herself offers an elegant definition of this expansive counterpoint to the contraction of certitude. Mystery is the capacity of something to keep becoming, to go beyond, to be circumscribable, to contain more. "Men Explain Things to Me," according to Popova, is a sobering and ennobling read in its totality. Complement this particular portion with astrophysicist Marcelo Gleiser on how to live with mystery in the age of knowledge. Then revisit Solnit on the annihilation of space and time, living with intelligent hope in dispiriting times, the rewards of walking, how maps can oppress and liberate, and why we read. So, I take this as a very serious, so I read this in class. I would always ask some students to do it or something. But I read this to you in order for us to now unpack this fragment. And of course, I picked this particular page of brain pickings for content and form, because when you go for form, every single page of Popova's brain pickings does the same thing. I mean, this last fragment in which she says, complement this particular portion with, and then a wild variety of links actually appear, that's her. But now let's focus on this one. So the difficult art of counter-criticism. What you see here, so in the first sentence where she refers to Woolf, that's really a hyperlink to some of Woolf's autobiographical writings in the edition Moments of Being. So the archival positivism stuff is there, because remember that Solnit actually writes about Woolf. Then here, when you go to the actual essay, Woolf's Darkness of Solnit, you see that this essay reads Woolf through Lawrence Gonzalez, Borges, Dinesen, Orwell, Thoreau, Sontag, Keats, some botanists in Hawaii, Whitman, Rimbaud, Joyce, Ovid, this friend, another friend, a painter, And at 3 moments in the essay, words are invented for what we in this context call diffractions. She actually says that these particular texts interpolate, dovetail, and draw out relationships that might have been unseen. Then when we go on, this opening quote of what counter-criticism is, so it expands the work of art by connecting it, opening up its meanings, inviting in the possibilities. That affirmative register that Solnit is actually working on, I think it is very much in line with new materialist or post-humanist methodologies for academia, art, and activism. And then Popova keeps on coming up with words for what we call diffractions. So this moment of you're suddenly drawn to or catapulted in the a piece of scholarship, a piece of art that has apparently, according to the classification, nothing to do with the text that you're reading. So here she says it calls to mind. And these diffractions, they continue. I could have put this arrow everywhere in this text. And let's see, when you actually, when you actually click on all of the links, so the underlined fragments are links, you see that Popova is not only working with this Native American storyteller, but also T.S. Eliot, Woolf, Huxley, Sontag, White, and many other authors are brought in through the hyperlinks of this particular article to other articles on brain pickings, because that's what Popova does. So she's also working with Albert Einstein, and there's like she is very much talking about. Let's see. I think it is very much something like Popova writing as an agency of observation in the Baradian sense. So it's not only Popova, but she's really working with her own hyperlinks. So it's Popova and brain pickings that are producing this particular narrative. And at the end, in the reading suggestions, there is a bunch of counterintuitive links popping up, and these links are counterintuitive, which is important, in relation to canonical readings and classifications of these very texts. And I fell in love with brain pickings precisely because of the particular philosophical apparatus or artistic philosophical apparatus that it produces. She really makes extremely explicit how we read and write, but we're not always allowed to read and write that way. I think that's important. These classifications in academia are oppressive, and we all know that the right thing has to be in the bibliography, and especially for students, but also for ourselves when we want our publications. But on the other hand, that's not the writing experience or the reading experience. So she is actually also very verbal about her own methodology. So Popova is producing lots of text for us to look at in terms of, so what does it mean to be written in a way, to write and to be written. And this is what she says in an interview that she once gave, this is the transcript, an interview that she once gave or did with Krista Tippett of On Being, which is a podcast. So she says, Popova says, I was recently visiting my family, and my grandmother, my father's mother, who's the atheist intellectual, showed me for the first time all of these books that her father, my great-grandfather, who died 6 days before I was born, whom I never met, and he was an astronomer and mathematician, and he taught himself English and German by hacking the radio to tune in to the BBC and Deutsche Welle. And then he taught my dad and my uncle, both German and English. But he had these books in which he showed me that he had smuggled from England somehow. And there were first edition Hemingway and Scott Fitzgerald. And he had, his marginalia were extraordinary. And I felt this strange kinship with him through the years, through the cultures and the eras and these different media. Because what I do when I read is essentially what he did, which is he wrote in the margins all these notes on things that he didn't understand and wanted to understand. He underlined passages that he noted were beautiful language and words that he didn't know, that he would look up in the dictionary. He would circle them and then write the translation. But it was this sort of intellectual dance with another mind that you could see in the margins of his books. And I was just very moved by it. So, and then Tippett talks about the fact that actually Popova does this herself. You can actually hyperlink something nowadays and actually look up that word that you don't know. And Popova also unpacks that she says in the end, seeing these books of his added a different layer of understanding to this thing, which I've been saying for a while, which is literature is the original internet. That's her idea. And originally, I meant it in the sense of you look at a book and then in it, every footnote and allusion and reference is essentially a hyperlink to another work, except it only works backwards. It only goes back in time, you know. And marginalia of this sort, it goes back and forth because it is the present mind conversing with a past mind. So it's a different kind of hypertext, I guess. Well, anyway. So I'm really interested in how explicit her and how present and available her archive of citations actually is. And together with two students in my program, Liberal Arts and Sciences, two students that major in computer science, we have worked in the last couple of months on actually visualizing her, visualizing brain pickings, which was a massive undertaking, not necessarily because of the code or because of like what is data visualization or whatever, but it was difficult because of the sheer size. So what my students did is this was their first image of brain pickings. So it's this gigantic and inaccessible cloud of links. So all of the dots are, first they were articles linking to other articles. But I'm interested in names that are mentioned in the articles linking to other names because I'm interested in non-linear zigzagging production of knowledge. So they've been working on different ways of visualizing. So then they visualized this website by focusing on the names. So you can see that Susan Sontag and Maurice Sendak are very often, and Carl Sagan are quoted all the time, cited all the time by Maria Popova. So this is Sendak, for example, and all of these links are actually links from Sendak to all kinds of other authors. And you know Sendak writing children's books, so going to philosophy, high theory, everything, back and forth in time. Another way of representing this, so here they picked the guy who wrote Thinking Fast and Slow. I think that's my students like it, or they intuit that has something to do with diffractive reading. So they found all of the links from Thinking Fast and Slow through the website that looks like this. And here the student writes, this is actually his location. I think that's so cute. This is Hannah Arendt, so they clicked on Hannah Arendt and figured out how many, to which scholars she is apparently, according to Popova, connected. Of course, this is an apparatus that we have to research, so there's a lot behind it that I'm now not going to talk about. Susan Sontag, different ways of representing links. Yeah, so. Okay, so why have I told you all this? And I forgot, is it like until 10 or 10:15 that I have? 10, yeah. 10. 11, yeah, sorry. Okay, so I have 12 minutes left. I'm using this to work on these three philosophers that I'm working on. This is what they look like. Suzanne Langer, that's Helene Metzger, and this is the only picture I've been able to locate of Eva Louise Young from the back. Cool. It's talking about being eclipsed, you know? This is the perfect image. But looking at these two men, her brother and some high official, how they look at her, I'm like, she must have been an amazing woman. So people have written a lot about Suzanne Langer. For example, Masumi has, in his recent book, has written about her. Helene Metzger is mentioned in the first footnote to The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Kuhn as a major source of inspiration. But her critical essays, her epistemological work has not been translated yet. And Eva Louise Young published one philosophy book, A Philosophy of Reality. So first, Langer. Howard Gardner has written about Langer and said that her work cannot be catalogued. So she is somebody who wrote in 1942, she published Philosophy in a New Key with Harvard University Press, and that was actually her PhD dissertation that she did with Whitehead. And I became interested in her because she always says that Whitehead and Cassirer are her main sources of inspiration. And I was like, how do you put these two guys together? Okay, that's, so she cannot be catalogued. She also wrote a lot about art in a book called Feeling and Form. But what is interesting to me about her work is that she has statements like this. She says, despite all shortcomings, blind leads, or mistakes that they may see in each other's doctrines, I believe that Bell, Fry, Bergson, Groce, Banch, Collingwood, Cassirer, and I, not to forget such literary critics as Barfield and Day-Lewis and others too, whom I have not named and perhaps not even read, have been and are really engaged on one philosophical project. Blah, blah. But, I mean, this is, of course, amazing. Others too, whom I have not named and perhaps not even read. She also says, well, this is, of course, what got me thinking. She also says in Feeling and Form that there is a literature behind us, known or unknown to any particular thinker. Like, how profound is that? But then what do we do with it? Well, I'm trying to be inspired by Popova in order to figure out how can we actually write accurately about her philosophical apparatus. And in Philosophy in a New Key, this passed as a PhD dissertation, she said that quotations could be multiplied almost indefinitely. Wonderful. So I have developed some sort of speculative method with which I can work on Langer's massive archive. Massive, I mean, these citations are just, she wants to quote everything. And I did this by working with and actually scanning. So these are just some pictures of while I was doing that. I scanned a book that in the 70s and 80s, I guess, students had to read. It's like a Bible-sized book that students had to read before they could actually read Langer. And it's called The Modern Tradition. And it has lots of like short pieces of basically the entire philosophical heritage. But I had to scan it myself in order to do something with it. This is my cat who loved it. And I thought it was quite aesthetic as an experience. So I scanned it at some point. And of course, what I want to do with it is I want to visualize it just like these students of mine have visualized the archive of Popova, the ever-expanding archive of Popova. But I haven't gotten that far, and it's also I don't want to show the students how I've been for one summer, like playing around with digital methods that they can do much better. So I try to do the same with Metzger. So Metzger, French historian of science who wrote a lot of history of science books, but also some critical essays on philosophy of science and the practice of doing history of science. And she says she has also an amazing take on what it means to be a scholar. So this is some of it is mine, some of it is her. So Metzger's many studies into the history of the natural sciences have led her to conclude that whilst constantly searching for a deepened understanding of the past, the historian also tries to, this is Metzger, my translation, penetrate with greater certainty and more active sympathy the creative thinking of the past in which he, 1930s, infuses new life that he revives for a moment. Moreover, there is a personal subjective factor which is impossible to eliminate completely. It is better to admit it honestly than to deny it a priori. Historians, like all philosophers, like all scientists, and like all humans, have innate tendencies, individual but imperceptible ways of thinking that are themselves not yet opinions or even systems of thought, but that can and do engender such opinions and systems. Of course, for me, these imperceptible ways of thinking are Bergson's objective movement, and they actually allow for all of these diffractions, these scribblings in the margins, to happen. She also says, for example, that the historian tries to find or recreate for a moment in itself the forces underlying the works that are the object of his meditation. So she's really into, like, in a way, writing almost in a new materialist or post-humanist way avant la lettre, what it actually means to be a scholar. 5 minutes. The speculative method that I have to use for Metzger and that I haven't started with yet is completely different. It's more like an institutional method with which I may be able to speculate on the archive of Metzger. She never, I mean, there is no archive. She never got a proper job, so she was always librarian or secretary or whatever. As the only woman in historical epistemology kind of fields in France in the interwar period. And as I said, died in 1944. So you can imagine what happened there, unfortunately. But what is clear in this book that are her collected essays on the philosophical method and history of science and history of sciences. She writes commentaries on all of the lectures at the Centre de Synthèse that she has attended. So and there are absolutely no references in these essays. But I think we may be able, by going to the center, we may be able to recreate what she must have heard and may have read. And reminder, I mean, Solnit, of course, writes very much in this Wolf's Darkness essay on speculative method. She says, there is so much we don't know, and to write truthfully about a life, your own or your mother's, or a celebrated figure's, an event, a crisis, another culture, is to engage repeatedly with those patches of darkness, those nights of history, those places of unknowing. And that's kind of what I'm trying to work with, or that I'm trying to work through my 3 historical case studies. Then the last one, quotes, I'm not going to read. These are just, so Eva Louise Young wrote A Philosophy of Reality that was literally brought to me by Google Books. So this is once I was doing new materialist research, and at some point this was on my search results list. So this is literally what I saw, A Philosophy of Reality by Eva Louise Young. And of course, I thought, who is she? Like, I had never heard of Eva Louise Young, a philosopher, Eva Louise Young, before. And I immediately noticed that she didn't publish her name as Eva Louise Young. She published her book, she never published her book as Eva Louise Young. She published it as E.L. Young. So I have been incredibly interested in trying to figure out what this is. Like what kind of knowledge production do we see here, and who is actually doing the knowing? Because I think that Google Books is really publishing a fact here, namely that A Philosophy of Reality was written by Eva Louise Young, whereas the artifact itself doesn't show you that. And I've been, I read the book, of course, and I was struck by the intense materialist philosophy or vitalist philosophy that is in, that is actually that book. I mean, that is her proposal. And no citations, like no references whatsoever. But seeing all of this, I knew she would be relevant for me. So what I've been writing about, and this is my last slide, I think this is, well, almost. I have really tried to find out what this is. And I found out that there is, in the field of bioinformatics, there's a whole theory and methodology around what they call micro-attribution and nano publication, which means that the smallest facts are get footnoted and get databased. And this is what I have tried to use in order to find out what the apparatus of Google Books is, and how that piece of knowledge, A Philosophy of Reality, was written by Eva Louise Young, what that actually is. So and of course this has kept me from writing more about her philosophy, because I became so interested in how it was brought to me. So to wrap up, where am I at? Interactions, using this wonderful sign for it. I'm interested in thinking about close and distant reading, and now I'm doing something that I'm not supposed to do. Close and distant reading. I'm interested in including the non-text based in politics of citation. Intellectual and material labor. I mean, the scanning of the book was a lot of work, and actually really physical. Positivist and speculative methodologies, and classification and cartography. And that was basically what I had to say.